Because I handed off my packet at the Botanical Gardens, I didn't go through all the vocabulary terms I meant to before you dispersed. But I came around and talked with most of you about the terms so that you could answer the questions that were in your packet for the Botanical Gardens. Um, but I'm going to go through those terms in this chapter as we talk about seedless plants, and then again in chapter 26 as we talk about the seeded plants. So basically, the four main groups of plants that I had you guys look at when we were at Smith College were the mosses, the ferns, the gymnosperms or cone-bearing plants, and then the angiosperms or flowering plants. And did any of you look at the plant evolution mural while you were at the Botanical Gardens? You guys were running around trying to find plants. You did briefly when we first walked in. Yeah, it was on the wall there. And one of the things that you'll see, just like we see when we talk about animals, is there's this progression through time where different species were dominant, right? In the age of dinosaurs, the reptiles were dominant and mammals were few. And then we kind of, with the extinction of the dinosaurs, moved into a mammal dominant phase, right? So there were times where all of the land plants were simple mosses and ferns. And then we move into a period of time where we have a world dominated by ferns and then gymnosperms. And now we're in the age of flowering plants. Like most of our plants are flowering plants. It's just going to be like that for a few minutes. They are pumping their water samples across a very, very fine pored filter to create a culture of microorganisms living in water. And so at least they're not doing it during an exam, because one time they were doing this lab while we were taking our exam and everybody was just like, can't take it. It's really squeaky. So I'll be squeaky for a while. I'm sorry. It's just the microbiology class doing their thing. This is not posted yet because I was pulled away from my office. There was a little small crisis, but hopefully it's okay now. So I'll get it posted. Hopefully between this class and my next class, I'll run up and try to finish those things I was doing. Um, so this is chapter 25 in your textbook, seedless plants. There are some sections in this chapter I'm going to skim over and not go into full detail on, and other sections I'll spend more time on. So as usual, use the PowerPoint as kind of your guiding for what I'm going to focus on. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about early plant life and sort of characteristics and things we need to know about plants in general in order to talk about the different groups of plants. We'll talk really briefly about green algae, and then we'll move on and talk about the bryophytes and the tracheophytes, the mosses and ferns. So our plant ancestors, much like our animal ancestors, evolved in water, right? They started in an aquatic life. And when you live in an aquatic world, um, there are some characteristics of life, right? In the aquatic world, nutrients are pretty abundant. Um, you have the ability to move your gametes and your zygotes around on the water current. And so you have the ability to have gametes that can swim, um, early zygotes that are able to develop and float or move on the current to a new location. And there's buoyancy. And so both of these pictures show you some freshwater stoneworts, which are thought to be, although that's maybe changing a little bit now based on genetic data, the closest living relatives of modern land plants. And so these are aquatic algae. And if you notice, like this plant is down here in the substrate, it's got some roots that are growing, and the body of the plant is really thin. These stems are pretty thin, and the plant's just floating in the water, right? And so one of the big differences among many is you transfer from a life in the water to life in land is that you lose that buoyancy. This individual can get very large and just kind of float in the water. If it produces some small pockets of air in its cells, it basically makes a bopper that helps to keep its body upright. And so the organism is going to just be buoyant in the water. And when you move to a dry land environment, you no longer have that to promote your structure. So just like as we moved to land, we had to develop more robust skeletons in order for animals to be able to combat gravity and grow large. Plants are also going to have a way to combat gravity as they grow larger. When you move to life on dry land, One of the big things that changes that is a benefit is now sunlight is practically unlimited. When you're a plant that's living in the water, your sunlight is filtered through the surface of the water. And so some huge portion of light that hits the surface of the water is reflected away by the water, right? Why do you have to be careful about getting a sunburn when you are on a boat or swimming, right? A lot of that sunlight is reflected back to at the surface. And only a small portion of the sunlight goes through and penetrates the water and gets to life below the surface. But on land, sunlight is really abundant. You have lots of it available to you if you're a plant out in the open. You also have an abundant source of carbon dioxide. The atmosphere is much richer in carbon dioxide than the water is, so you have more raw materials for photosynthesis. You've got lots of sunlight and lots of CO2. What other ingredient of photosynthesis do you need that might be in a lower supply? Water, right? When you were in the water, you were surrounded by water. Water was never limiting. Now on land, water is going to be a much more limiting factor. You've got plenty of carbon dioxide, plenty of sunlight, but you don't have very much water depending on where you are found. So, challenge to life on dry land, increased gravity and a lack of buoyancy, and then greatly reduced moisture. I feel like this is about the saddest picture of a tree I could find. Here it is in a parking lot by the truck parking next to a McDonald's in this tiny little scrap of land, right? Doesn't have a lot of access to water, doesn't have a lot of access to moisture. But some of our land plants face this challenge, right? How do you survive in an environment where it's very dry, where nutrients are not very abundant? Maybe surrounding structures are impacting your sunlight availability. If you're below the canopy in a forest or you're near a building in a parking lot, you have more things to deal with. Okay, so we see some adaptations in our land plants to try to combat these. And these are just sort of generic plant adaptations. We'll talk specifically about where they arise as we go through the groups. Not all of our plants have all of these things, but I want to mention, like, while we're talking about adaptations, what are some ways you combat this dry land environment full of gravity, and how do you deal with the resources that are available? And so one way you can control moisture is to have a cuticle. And so many of the plants that we see, any of our land plants that don't live in a damp environment have a cuticle. And the cuticle is just like your epidermis. It's an outer, non-living covering to the surface of the body. Okay. The cuticle of plants tends to be chock full of waxes. And so, if any of you have ever had a plant that has sort of a white film on the surface of the leaf, sometimes you can feel it, sometimes you can like scratch it with your fingernail and see that film. That is a waxy coating, and that is a waterproof barrier. It keeps the body water inside and provides a barrier to evaporative water loss. Yeah, in some cases. You'll see that their leaves are often really waxy. Um, and tropical plants have a problem with uh, too much water, mildews and funguses and blights growing on the surface of them and having their leaves be kind of saturated by the 100% humidity of the environment. So they actually tend to have anatomical structures to help shed water. And so you'll see they actually might have groove notches at the base of the leaf to collect dew and run it off and run it down towards the roots and away from the leaves so they're not so completely saturated. Because if they're completely saturated, then that greatly reduces air exchange, right? Um, then we have the stomata, and the stomata are pores on the leaf surface that permits gas exchange. And so here we have a picture of two stomata. This one is open. You can see the dark circle in the center here. This is where carbon dioxide is diffusing in and oxygen is diffusing out. This one up here is closed, just like you can press your lips closed. Stomata can close. They do this by changing the flow of water. They move water out of their cells in order to collapse the cell. But this closed stomata is not going to be doing gas exchange. And so one of the ways that plants can reduce their evaporative water loss is to close down their stomata when there's a big differential between outside humidity and inside the body humidity. So they can basically shut down so they're not losing moisture through those gas exchange openings. Yeah. So many desert plants will have their stomata completely closed during the day, and they only open them up at night when temperature drops and the sun is down and not being baked in the sun. Yep. Um, so again, to prevent desiccation. Plant embryos are maybe something that you don't think about very much, but every time you eat a seed or a nut, or a grain, you are eating an embryo of a plant, right? The embryo of a plant, much like the embryo of an animal, is multicellular. It's not just a single fertilized egg. It's a multicellular embryo that begins to grow. That embryo develops while it's attached to the parent and is dependent to the parent on the parent for nutrition early on. And then just like Mama frog leaves a yolk in her eggs, Mama bird leaves a yolk in her eggs and then leaves those eggs to develop outside of the individual's body. The multicellular embryos that are housed in seeds are packed with nutrients. And so when you think about eating a nut, like you imagine like eating a walnut, right? You are eating all of the nutrients that walnut tree packed into the seed to nourish that developing embryo, right? The reason that nuts and um, grains are so nutritious is that they have everything that plant needs to grow. And so this is a seed that's been cut open. This is actually the embryo here, the developing baby plant. And when the seed finalizes and hardens and gets ready to leave the parent plant, the embryo is suspended at its current state of development and it's just arrested. And so the embryo remains kind of in this arrested development phase where it's not growing or developing anymore, and it's packed in this packet of nutrition. So all of this is starches and fats and sugars and things that the plant needs to grow. And then when the seed finds itself in a habitable environment, it's going to germinate or begin to grow again. And so the embryo that is already here will begin to grow, feeding off of the nutrition that's provided in the seed. And then it will use that nutrition to grow until it's tall enough to poke its head above the soil and reach sunlight on its own, where it'll begin to carry out photosynthesis and make its own food. So just like the yolk has to sustain an animal embryo until it's ready to feed itself or to be fed by its parent, this seed will sustain our plant embryo until it's able to carry out photosynthesis on its own. Does that make sense? Okay. The seed is coated in a hard, robust surface that protects it from the environment and prevents desiccation so that all those nutrient resources don't dry out. Okay. When you think of your classic animal life cycle, you think of animals being diploid, and they spend most of their life in a dominant diploid state. And then they produce haploid gametes, and they have produced those gametes by meiosis, right? That's sort of an animal life cycle. The plant life cycle is not like that at all. We don't have the same dominant diploid state, and we don't produce gametes via meiosis in plants. Plants have a life cycle that's known as alternation of generations, and so there's actually separate diploid and haploid generations. Okay. Sometimes those generations occur in the same body, and we'll see that when we get to our gymnosperms and our angiosperms. Sometimes those generations occur sort of in a separate apparatus to that individual's body, but we have these separate diploid and haploid generations. And so one of the questions you guys were answering at the botanical garden was about whether you're seeing the sporophyte or the gametophyte, right? The sporophyte is the diploid generation of a plant with diploid body cells. So any plant whose body is diploid is going to be a sporophyte. In most of our higher plants, our flowering plants and our cone-bearing plants, the sporophyte is what you see. Okay, that is the structure that you're exposed to out in the world. Some of the cells within the sporophyte will undergo meiosis and produce haploid spores. So meiosis is going to produce spores. Those spores, in the case of our lower plants, can just go out into the world, and wherever they land, they can grow into a new plant. In other plants, those haploid spores develop into haploid bodies that are housed within the plant's body, and they create the gametophyte, which is enclosed within the plant's body. The gametophyte is the gamete producing structure. So phyte, P-H-Y-T-E, is the word that we use for plant. So all of our plants are phytes. You'll see that they are tracheophyte, they are bryophyte, right? Phyte means plant. And so the sporophyte is the spore producing plant, and the gametophyte is the gamete producing plant. Okay? We're going to use these words over and over again, so hopefully they become familiar. So here's our alternation of generations. We call this a haplodiplontic life cycle because they are equally haploid and diploid. It's not like you have this big dominant diploid phase and a short little haploid phase, and it's not like you have a big long haploid phase and a short little diploid phase. They have both of these generations in their life cycle. Okay, so if we start with a gametophyte, the gametophyte is haploid, and the gametophyte is going to produce gametes via mitosis because it's already haploid. So that's already counter to everything that you think about when you think about mitosis, right? Because you think about mitosis as producing diploid cells, right? That's only in an animal body. In a haploid body, in the gametophyte, mitosis is going to produce haploid gametes. So the gametophyte is going to produce egg and sperm via mitosis. Those egg and sperm will join together and fertilization will occur. And then we will have a diploid zygote. That diploid zygote is going to undergo mitosis to make the diploid sporophyte, the spore producing generation of the plant. That diploid sporophyte will make spores via meiosis. So it's still having its genetic material via meiosis, but the product of meiosis is not egg and sperm. The product of meiosis is spores. Those spores that are haploid are going to be able to go out and grow up into a gametophyte through mitosis and differentiation. So this is a different life cycle than we're used to with animals. Half of the life cycle is spent in a haploid state up here at the top. Half of the life cycle is in the diploid state down here at the bottom. The diploid sporophyte produces spores via meiosis, which generate and grow into a gametophyte plant. The gametophyte makes egg and sperm via mitosis. Okay. Big difference from animal life. So a sporophyte forms when two gametes fuse. So the sporophyte is diploid. It's going to be the product of two gametes, egg and spore, joining, and it is going to produce spores via meiosis. And sporophytes can either be homosporous or heterosporous. So again, don't get bogged down in these vocabulary terms, but think about the root words. Homo means same, hetero means different, right? So a homosporous sporophyte makes one type of spores. All of the spores are the same, right? A heterosporous sporophyte is going to make different spores. And those different spores are microspores and megaspores. Microspores will give rise to pollen. Megaspores will give rise to eggs. So a megaspore is larger, a microspore is smaller. Usually, yeah, microspores are more abundant. Okay, so here is a bed of moss, like we were looking at in the pots at the botanical garden. And in this bed of moss, the green structures that you are looking at are all gametophytes. And some of those gametophytes have a sporophyte sticking up from them, and they have grown the spore producing structure as a result of fertilization. And so in mosses, the dominant body form is the gametophyte, and the sporophyte is a special structure that occurs seasonally. Okay. A spore can develop into into a new organism without fusing with another cell. So a spore doesn't need to undergo fertilization. It doesn't have to meet a spore of a different type. A spore is like an organism in a packet, ready to go. So any spore that settles down in a good spot is going to be able to grow into a new organism without finding any other cells to join with. Okay. The spore is really tough-walled. It can last for a long time. It's resistant to environmental conditions, and it is able to disperse easily by air or water. It's small, it's easily carried on the breeze, it's easily carried via water downriver or downstream or across a lake, and it can settle down and grow wherever it lands. The gametophyte develops from spores. This heart-shaped structure here is the gametophyte of a fern, and the scale here is showing you that this line is 1 millimeter, so this is pretty small. You're not going to see it well without at least a dissecting scope or a hand lens. The gametophyte is going to be haploid, and the gametophyte is going to produce gametes via mitosis. Okay? So the gametophyte is going to produce the egg and the sperm. In the case of this fern, it's going to produce the egg and the sperm both on the surface of the same gametophyte. It just has specialized regions, one region for producing egg and one region for producing sperm. Okay, so if we look across our different groups of plants, starting with our algae that are living in a water environment, right? In this water environment, the algae is supported by the water, carries out photosynthesis, and has flagellated sperm that can swim from the sperm producing structure and join with an egg producing structure, right? As we move up to land, our earliest plants are the mosses. The mosses are going to have to live in a damp environment, and they're going to they're going to be small bodied and found in damp environments. And that's because they are relatively primitive. They have very minimal roots to anchor the plants. They don't have any structures like lignin and vascular tissue to help them grow large body size and to combat gravity. And they require moisture because they still have flagellated sperm. So in order for sexual reproduction to produce new individuals, the sperm have to be able to swim between individuals. And so they require, a layer of dewdrops or rain or something to help them disperse their sperm. Ferns are a little bit bigger, but still found typically in a moist environment. Ferns have a little bit more of a root system to help anchor them. They have some reinforcement in their cell walls that allows them to get larger. They also have vascular tissue, which allows them to transport nutrients further, but they still have flagellated sperm, so they require moisture for fertilization. They don't require moisture to produce and release spores, but they do if they're going to fertilize egg with sperm. And then we move to our much more terrestrially adapted plants like the pine tree and the flowering trees beyond that. Now we have much stronger root system for anchoring, lignin and cellulose in the cell walls to help reinforce them and get a larger body size. Complex vascular tissue for transporting nutrients throughout the plant's entire body, and no longer relying on flagellated sperm. Instead, we produce pollen grains, and those pollen grains can go out on the wind and fertilize eggs of other individuals in order to produce seeds. And the primary mode of production, once we move up to our gymnosperms, is seeds. The spores are now microscopic and housed within the plant's body and give rise to the structures that produce the pollen and the seeds. And so we don't ever actually see spore dispersal once we get to our higher plants. Okay, so we'll see that journey as we kind of go through these groups. So I want to give you an overview of some of the changes. The gametophyte? The gametophyte is actually going to be those little spore structures, the megaspores and the microspores that are housed inside the plant's body. We don't ever actually see the gametophyte. This tree is all sporophyte. The fern is also sporophyte, and we don't actually see the gametophyte except for that little tiny, this is the gametophyte of a fern. It's really small, and you're unlikely to ever encounter it unless you germinate fern spores and watch them grow up. You'll see it. Okay, I'm going to stop there because we only have 1 minute. We'll talk a little bit about green algae, bryophytes, and seedless vascular plants on Thursday. We will start seed plants, chapter 26, on Thursday. And then for our lab, we will briefly talk about population ecology and go out and sample our salamander population plots here in the forest. So we will have a short hike in the forest. So wear sturdy shoes or boots. The forest is full of ticks again, so wear protective clothing. It might be raining on Thursday. We're going to go outside anyway, but we won't be outside for a very long time because we're going to bring our salamanders back to the lab to observe them. Okay? All right. Have a good afternoon. What's up?